It was a calm evening in the heart of the Vatican, the kind of evening when the air itself carried a sense of reverence. The sun was setting behind the grand dome of St. Peter's Basilica, painting the marble walls in gold and amber. Inside the ancient corridors, footsteps echoed as cardinals, guests, and musicians made their way toward the Hall of Saints, a room rarely opened for public performances. Tonight was a special occasion, a celebration of faith and music, a night where the spiritual and the artistic would meet. At the center of it all sat Pope Leo XIV. Despite his age, his posture remained straight, his eyes bright with quiet curiosity. He was a man known not only for his deep faith but for his love of music, a love that began long before he ever wore the white robes. Those who knew him well said he had once played the piano in his youth, before his life was overtaken by duty and prayer. Now, many years later, he was attending a concert that promised to bring together the best pianists in the world. The hall was breathtaking. Tall arches framed walls painted with scenes of saints and miracles. Chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, their crystal drops glowing in warm light. The scent of polished wood and incense filled the room. Rows of guests dressed in their finest whispered excitedly, waiting for the evening to begin. Reporters from around Europe had gathered too, their cameras ready, hoping to capture a moment of grace, or perhaps something unexpected. At the front of the hall stood a grand piano, gleaming under the lights. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a work of art, built by hand decades ago and played only on rare occasions. Every eye seemed to rest on it, waiting for the music that would soon rise from its keys. The master of ceremonies stepped forward and announced the first performer. One by one, talented pianists played, each performance a beautiful expression of skill and dedication. The air filled with classical pieces, soft and grand, each met with polite applause. Yet everyone in the room was waiting for one particular performer, Elena Marconi, the young pianist from Florence who had become famous for her brilliance and her pride. When her name was called, a stir went through the crowd. Elena entered the hall with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Her silver gown shimmered as she walked, her chin slightly raised, her eyes sharp and self-assured. She bowed gracefully to the audience, though her gaze lingered on the Pope for a moment longer than seemed necessary. Some said she had a habit of testing boundaries, even with those above her. Elena sat at the piano, adjusted her seat, and let her hands hover above the keys. The room went still. Then she began to play. The first notes burst forth like fire, fast, flawless, alive. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with breathtaking precision. She moved with the grace of someone who had spent her entire life mastering control. Every chord was perfect, every pause deliberate. The melody soared, filled with emotion, yet there was something about it, a coldness, a sense that her music came more from pride than from heart. Still, the audience couldn't deny her talent. By the time she struck the final note, the hall erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Whispers of admiration filled the air. She stood, bowed again, and smiled. But her smile carried a hint of vanity. Then she turned toward Pope Leo XIV. Her voice rang through the hall, confident and slightly teasing. "Your Holiness," she said, "you have blessed the world with wisdom and faith. But tell us, do you ever bless the piano as well? Or does the music of heaven not need to touch the keys of earth?" The room fell silent. A few guests gasped quietly. Some turned to see how the Pope would react. Even the choir, seated to the side, exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever spoken to him like that during such an event. Elena continued, her tone still playful but edged with arrogance. "Perhaps," she said with a small smirk, "you might honor us with a melody of your own? Surely the Holy Father must have a tune or two hidden behind all those prayers." The moment hung heavy in the air. No one knew whether to laugh or remain silent. A young guard near the door shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the Pope. The hall, moments ago filled with applause, now felt frozen, but Pope Leo didn't seem offended. His face remained calm, his eyes kind. He looked at the young pianist with a gentle smile that carried neither pride nor anger. Slowly, he rose from his seat. The guests murmured, uncertain of what he intended to do. The Pope spoke softly, his voice calm and steady, yet it carried across the hall. "My dear," he said, "music is a gift from God. It does not belong to those who master it, but to those who feel it. And yes, sometimes even I remember a few old melodies." A faint laugh rippled through the audience, easing the tension. But Elena looked surprised, unsure if he was serious. To everyone's astonishment, Pope Leo began to walk toward the piano. His steps were slow but confident. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to stop him, but he waved them aside gently. The hall grew utterly silent once more. Even the air seemed to pause. The Pope reached the piano and rested a hand on its polished surface. For a moment he simply looked at it, almost as if he were greeting an old friend. The light from the chandeliers reflected in his eyes, and for the first time that evening the confident pianist standing nearby appeared uncertain. He looked up at her and said kindly, "May I?" She stepped aside, nodding without a word. The audience watched as the Pope sat down on the bench. He straightened his back, placed his trembling hands on the keys, and took a deep breath. "I haven't played in many years," he said with a small smile, "but music, like prayer, never leaves the soul." The hall was so quiet that one could hear the faint rustle of robes, the soft hum of the lights. Even the reporters lowered their cameras. No one wanted to break the moment. As the Pope prepared to play, the choir members glanced at one another, unsure if they were witnessing something profound or something that would end awkwardly. Elena stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Perhaps she still believed he would falter. But Pope Leo didn't seem nervous. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief second, as if searching for something deep within. A memory, a feeling, a sound that had once meant everything to him. His fingers pressed the first keys, hesitant but sure, and a soft, trembling note filled the air. The music that followed wasn't perfect, not in the way Elena's had been. His hands trembled slightly, his movements were slow, but there was something else in his playing, a kind of warmth that reached everyone who listened. Even before the melody fully formed, people could feel the sincerity behind every note. As the first few bars echoed through the grand hall, a deep hush fell over the room. It was the kind of silence that comes not from politeness but from awe. The Pope's music seemed to awaken something ancient and pure, something that reminded everyone why they had come there, not just to hear a performance, but to feel something beyond words. For now, the evening that had begun with grandeur and pride was turning into something more human, more humble, and though no one yet knew how deeply this moment would touch their hearts, one thing was clear: the night was far from over. Something extraordinary had just begun. The room was so still that one could hear the soft creak of the piano bench as Pope Leo adjusted his seat. The golden lights of the chandeliers shimmered on the polished surface of the grand piano. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on him, and yet he looked as calm as if he were alone in a small chapel. For a brief moment, even time seemed to hold its breath. The Pope's fingers rested gently on the keys. He didn't rush to play. He simply sat there, feeling the smooth touch of the ivory beneath his hands, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. The audience waited in total silence, some curious, others skeptical, and a few holding back nervous smiles. Many thought he might only play a few awkward notes for courtesy's sake. After all, how could a man so old and burdened with responsibility still play with grace? But then the first sound came, a single soft note, then another, forming a delicate thread of melody that floated through the air like a prayer. The music was quiet but carried an unusual warmth. It was not the kind of performance that sought to impress. It was one that seemed to speak to the soul. People began to lean forward in their seats, listening closely. The tune was unfamiliar yet oddly comforting, as if it carried a memory that everyone shared but had long forgotten. The Pope's hands moved slowly, with care and emotion rather than speed or display. Each note seemed to carry a story, each pause a breath of reflection. The young pianist who had mocked him stood off to the side, arms crossed at first, her expression distant. She had expected hesitation, perhaps even failure, but now her face began to change. There was something in the music that she couldn't ignore, something raw and human. It wasn't flawless, but it was real. The Pope played on, unaware of the effect he was having. His eyes were half closed, his face peaceful. He wasn't performing for applause or approval. He was remembering. Every note he played seemed to come from a place deep inside his heart, from years of quiet prayer and unspoken emotion. As the music filled the hall, people began to feel its weight. Some lowered their heads. Others clasped their hands together, not in applause but in stillness. Even the journalists who had come expecting a story of spectacle found themselves caught in something entirely different. The melody had a way of silencing the noise inside people, A few members of the choir recognized the tune. It was an old hymn, one the Pope himself had written decades ago when he was a young priest. The hymn was said to have been inspired by a personal loss, something few people knew details about. It was a song about peace after pain, about forgiveness, about faith that survives sorrow. Hearing it again after all these years, played by the very man who had written it, filled the hall with emotion that words could not capture. As the piece continued, the Pope's frail hands trembled slightly, but his touch on the keys remained gentle and sure. He moved not with the sharp control of a trained performer, but with the feeling of someone who truly understood what the notes meant. The music rose and fell softly like a whisper of memory passing through the air. Elena, the pianist who had challenged him, felt her chest tighten as she listened. For years she had believed that music was about perfection, about mastering technique, about being flawless. But now she realized that what she was hearing wasn't perfection. It was truth. She had spent her life trying to prove her worth through sound, while the old man sitting at the piano needed no proof at all. He played not to impress but to share. The longer he played, the deeper the room seemed to sink into the moment. The walls of the grand hall, usually echoing with formality and ritual, now carried a silence filled with emotion. Even those who did not understand music could feel it. The melody reached into something sacred inside each listener. Then came a pause. The Pope lifted his hands slightly from the keys, letting the final notes fade into the still air. The silence that followed felt like the breath between heartbeats. No one dared to move. No one clapped. Even the sound of the candles flickering seemed distant. The Pope opened his eyes and looked toward the young pianist. His expression was kind, not triumphant, not mocking, just peaceful. He smiled softly and said, "Music is not a competition, my child. It is a prayer made with sound." His words hung in the air. Helena lowered her eyes, her pride melting away. She wanted to speak, but no words came. Something inside her, something she hadn't known was missing, had been stirred awake. For the first time in her life, she felt small in the most humbling way. The Pope stood slowly from the bench, and as he did, the entire audience rose to their feet. It wasn't the usual kind of applause. It was a silent standing, a gesture of respect so pure that it felt like part of the music itself. Only after several moments did the applause begin, soft at first, then growing, but still reverent. Elena stepped closer and whispered to him, "Your Holiness, I didn't know music could do that." He looked at her gently and replied, "It always could. You just have to let it come from the heart, not the hands." The crowd watched as the Pope returned to his seat. The atmosphere in the hall had completely changed. The arrogance that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by awe. The choir members, still moved, wiped tears from their eyes. Even the skeptical journalists forgot their notes and cameras for a moment, caught up in the emotion of what they had witnessed. The rest of the evening continued, but nothing that followed matched that single performance. Every musician who came after played beautifully, yet the audience remained subdued, as though they were still wrapped in the memory of what they had just heard. The Pope's quiet melody had left an impression that no technical brilliance could erase. When the concert finally ended, people lingered, unwilling to leave. Conversations were hushed, almost sacred. Elena stayed behind, standing by the piano long after everyone else had gone. She ran her hand along the keys, her mind full of thoughts she couldn't quite form. The Pope's words echoed inside her. Music is a prayer made with sound. For the first time, she understood what it meant. She realized that real music wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about connection. It was about honesty, about letting one's heart speak when words were not enough. Outside, the night air was cool and still. The Vatican bells began to ring in the distance, their tones blending with the last memory of the melody. The stars over Rome seemed brighter than before. Inside the grand hall, the lingering warmth of the performance seemed to remain, as though the music itself had taken root in the walls. As the Pope left the hall with his gentle smile, those who had witnessed the moment knew they had seen something unforgettable. Not a display of skill, but a revelation of humanity. What began as a challenge had turned into a lesson in grace. The world would soon hear about it, but no story written in any newspaper would capture what it had felt like to be there, to see pride transformed into humility, and to hear the kind of music that could only come from the soul. That night the concert ended, but the story of that melody was only beginning to spread. A story of an old man who turned humiliation into harmony and left even the proudest hearts in silent reflection. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the high windows of the Vatican, painting the marble floors in shades of gold. The memory of the previous night's concert still lingered in the air like incense after prayer. Everyone who had been there could not stop speaking about it. Servants whispered in the halls, journalists rushed to their editors, and the choir still spoke in hushed tones about how the Pope had played like a man guided by heaven itself. But no one was more affected than Elena, the pianist who had once believed herself untouchable. She had left the concert quietly, avoiding the reporters waiting outside. That night, for the first time in her life, she could not sleep. The sound of the Pope's melody still played in her mind, repeating again and again. It was not the kind of tune one forgot. It carried something she could not explain, pain and peace woven together in every note. In her hotel room, the piano stood by the window, untouched. She sat before it for hours, her fingers hovering over the keys but refusing to play. Every time she tried to strike a note, she felt as if the instrument itself was asking her to stop, as if it too remembered the humility of the night before. By morning, she decided she couldn't leave things as they were. She needed to speak to him, the man she had mocked, the man who had taught her more in a few minutes than her entire life of study ever had. She dressed simply that day, without her usual glittering jewelry or fine fabrics. For the first time, she wanted to be just herself, not the famous pianist, not the performer adored by the crowds, but a person searching for something real. The Vatican guards recognized her immediately as she approached the gates. There was no arrogance in her steps now. She greeted them politely and asked if she could meet the Pope. One of them hesitated, unsure if such a request could be granted so easily. But seeing the sincerity in her eyes, he nodded and went to inquire. A few moments later, she was led through the quiet corridors of the Apostolic Palace. The walls were lined with centuries of paintings, but Elena barely noticed them. Her heart was beating fast, her hands slightly trembling. When the doors finally opened to a small study, she saw him sitting near the window reading. The sunlight framed his figure softly, his white robes glowing faintly in the light. He looked up, smiling kindly, as if he had expected her. "Ah," he said gently. "I thought I might see you today." She lowered her head, ashamed. "Your Holiness," she said, "I came to apologize. What I said last night was disrespectful. I don't know what came over me." The Pope gestured for her to sit. "Pride," he said softly. "Not as an insult, but as a simple truth. It comes to us all, my child. It came to me once too." She looked up, surprised. "To you," he nodded. "Long ago, before I wore this robe, I was a musician like you. Not a great one, but one who loved to play. I thought that mastering an instrument meant mastering the world. I believed that if my hands could control every note, my life would be in harmony. But life has a way of teaching us differently." She listened in silence as he continued. "When my sister fell ill many years ago, I played for her every day. I thought my music would heal her. But she left this world before the spring came. I stopped playing after that. I told myself that music was useless, that it couldn't save anyone. I joined the church to escape that pain. But over time, I learned that music was not meant to heal the body. It was meant to heal the soul." Elena felt her throat tighten. "The song you played last night?" she began quietly. He nodded. Yes, it was hers. It was the last melody she heard before she closed her eyes. Tears welled in Elena's eyes, though she tried to hide them. She had spent her life chasing applause, never realizing that the most powerful music came not from skill but from emotion. She had performed for thousands, but never once had she truly played for someone's soul. "I thought perfection was everything," she whispered. "But when you played, I realized how empty perfection sounds when there's no heart behind it." The Pope smiled gently. "Technique is a fine thing," he said, "but it's only the shell. The spirit is what brings it to life. You have been given a gift, but gifts are not meant to be shown off like treasures. They are meant to be shared to lift others. You already have everything you need. You just forgot why you started." Elena sat quietly, unable to respond. His words settled deep inside her. They were not grand or poetic, yet they carried more power than any applause she had ever received. After a while, he stood and walked toward the small piano in the corner of the room, a simple, wooden instrument far less impressive than the one from the concert. He lifted the cover gently and gestured to her. "Play something," he said softly. "Not for the crowd this time. Just for yourself," she hesitated. I don't think I can," he smiled again. "Then start with silence. Even silence has a rhythm." For a long moment she sat there, staring at the keys. Then slowly her hands began to move. The sound that came out was shaky at first, uncertain, but soon it grew steadier. She played a slow, heartfelt tune, one she hadn't touched since she was a child. It wasn't complex or showy. It was a lullaby her mother used to hum when times were hard. The Pope stood quietly beside her, listening. When she finished, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. "It's strange," she said softly. "For the first time, I feel like I really played." He nodded. "That's because this time you didn't play to be heard. You played to feel." Outside, the bells began to ring for midday prayer. The sunlight moved slowly across the room, touching the old piano with warmth. The Pope closed the lid gently and said, "You have a great journey ahead of you, my child. Let your music be your prayer. The world needs that more than it needs perfection." When she left the Vatican that day, something inside her had changed. She walked through the city streets unnoticed, her thoughts filled not with fame or future performances but with meaning. Every sound, the chatter of people, the song of birds, even the wind moving through the narrow streets, felt like music now. Back in her hotel, she sat at the piano again. But this time she didn't think about how her hands moved or how her audience might react. She closed her eyes and played the melody the Pope had played, slow, gentle, full of heart. The music filled the room like morning light, touching everything softly. For the first time in her life, she didn't need applause. She didn't need anyone to tell her she was great. The feeling that filled her heart was enough. She understood now what he had meant, that music was not about control but surrender. And though the world outside carried on as usual, something in that quiet room had shifted forever. The proud pianist who once mocked a holy man had found her humility through the very thing she thought she had mastered. Far away, in his small study, Pope Leo sat by the window once more. He could hear faint music drifting from the direction of the city, and he smiled to himself. The melody was familiar, a reflection of the one he had played the night before, but softer, gentler, alive. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks, not for victory or pride, but for the simple joy of seeing one more soul rediscover the meaning of her gift. The sun slowly dipped behind the rooftops of Rome, and though the day came to an end, the music, that quiet, human, humble music, continued to live on both in her heart and his. The hall was so silent that even the sound of the Pope's chair sliding against the marble floor echoed softly like a distant wave. No one had expected him to rise, not after what had just happened. He was old, his steps slow, yet every person in the room could feel the quiet authority that surrounded him as he moved toward the piano. The young pianist watched him with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. She had wanted to embarrass him, to make a point to prove that no one else in the room could touch her skill, but now something about the way he carried himself made her uneasy. The Pope smiled gently at the pianist as he reached the stage. "You have great talent, my dear," he said in a calm, steady tone. "But let me borrow your piano for a moment. Let an old man remember something." The pianist blinked, unsure if he was joking. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. The Pope's fingers, thin and lined with age, rested lightly on the edge of the piano as though touching something sacred. The silence stretched, no one dared speak. The choir members, standing along the side walls, looked at one another nervously. They had sung for the Pope many times, but none had ever seen him play. Many of them didn't even know he could. Finally, he sat down on the piano bench. He adjusted it slightly, his movements slow but sure. His hands hovered above the keys, trembling for a brief moment, and then, without warning, he began to play. At first, the notes came out uncertain, fragile, like a memory trying to find its way back. But soon something shifted. The trembling stopped. The sound deepened, grew warmer, fuller. It was not a performance meant to impress, but to touch the heart. The melody was simple, yet it carried so much feeling that even the smallest note seemed to breathe. It wasn't a grand or complex piece, not the kind that wins competitions or brings loud applause. It was something more personal. Each note seemed to tell a story. The Pope's hands, though old, moved with surprising grace as if guided by something beyond sight. The audience watched in stunned silence. The pianist who had mocked him earlier now stood frozen, her lips slightly parted. She had expected mistakes, hesitation, or awkward pauses, but what she heard instead was something she couldn't explain. The melody was sad yet peaceful. It held both sorrow and hope in perfect balance, like sunlight breaking through a storm. As the music continued, the faces in the crowd began to change. Even the guards near the back, who had stood expressionless all evening, now looked softer, their eyes glistening faintly. A few choir members pressed their hands to their mouths, afraid to make a sound. Then slowly the melody began to shift. It became more emotional, deeper, more aching. The Pope closed his eyes, lost in the music, and everyone could feel that he wasn't just playing a song. He was remembering something. Those who had known him for years suddenly understood. This was the melody he had written many years ago, a hymn that was never published, one he composed after losing his beloved sister. She had been a musician too, full of life and laughter. When she passed away, he had turned to the piano to speak the words he couldn't say aloud. And now, decades later, those same notes filled the Vatican Hall once again. Every stroke of the keys told a story, not of greatness or fame, but of love, loss, and peace. It was as though the Pope was speaking directly to every person in the room through his music, reminding them that beauty was not in perfection, but in feeling. The pianist stood still, tears starting to well in her eyes. She realized that this was the kind of music she had never been able to play. Her performances were flawless, her timing perfect, but she had never played like this, from the soul. For the first time, she saw that music wasn't about proving yourself. It was about sharing something real. The Pope's hand slowed. The melody grew softer, fading like a whisper. The final note lingered in the air, hanging there between silence and eternity. And then it was gone, no one moved. It was as if time itself had paused to listen. The vast hall, filled moments ago with pride and competition, now felt sacred. The sound of that final note seemed to stay in the walls, in the people, in their hearts. The Pope lifted his hands from the piano and rested them on his lap. He didn't look around to see the reaction. He just sat quietly, breathing softly, his eyes still closed. The pianist stepped forward slowly, unsure of what to say. She opened her mouth but couldn't find any words. The air was too full of meaning to speak. She finally whispered, "That song, it was beautiful. I've never heard anything like it." The Pope looked up at her, his eyes warm but filled with something deeper, kindness mixed with understanding. "It's not the song that matters, my child," he said softly. "It's what you put into it. Music is not made of notes. It is made of truth." His words sank into her heart. She lowered her gaze, ashamed of her earlier arrogance. I didn't mean to mock you," she said quietly. "I only wanted to test how far talent could go." The Pope smiled, a gentle, forgiving smile. "And now you know," he replied. "Talent can take you far, but humility takes you deeper." The choir members began to stir. A few of them were wiping tears from their eyes. Someone in the front row began to clap slowly, almost reverently. Soon the rest followed, not with the wild enthusiasm of a crowd at a concert, but with the soft, heartfelt applause of people who had witnessed something holy. The Pope stood up carefully, leaning slightly on the edge of the piano. "Let us not forget," he said, "that music was never meant to make us proud. It was meant to make us grateful." He turned to the choir. "My friends, you have sung many songs for others, but tonight I ask you to sing one for the soul." The choir nodded. They gathered together, forming a semicircle around the piano. One of them softly struck a note on the organ, and they began to sing. The hymn they chose was one that had not been heard in years, the very same hymn the Pope had played, now reborn in voices instead of keys. Their harmony rose gently, filling the hall like light spreading through glass. The Pope closed his eyes again, letting the sound wash over him. The pianist watched, feeling tears run down her cheeks freely now. She understood what true greatness looked like, not in applause or praise, but in peace. As the hymn came to an end, the audience stood together. No one shouted or cheered. They stood in silence, united by something far greater than performance. The pianist turned toward the Pope once more. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. He smiled again. "Thank the one who gave us music," he said. "We only borrow it for a time." When the concert finally ended, people left quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Some were crying, others simply thoughtful. No one had expected the evening to end this way. The pianist lingered behind as the hall emptied. She approached the piano and placed her hand gently on its smooth surface. She could still feel the warmth of his touch on the keys. It felt like touching something sacred. That night, as she left the Vatican, she looked up at the stars above St. Peter's Basilica. They seemed brighter somehow, clearer. She realized that she had not just witnessed a performance, she had been changed by it. From that day on, every time she played, she remembered his words. Her music began to sound different, softer, more honest, more alive. And though she still played for audiences, she never played for applause again. She played for something deeper, something the Pope had shown her with a single song. In that single evening, pride had turned into peace and competition into connection. The Pope hadn't needed to win anything. He had simply reminded everyone, including her, what music was truly meant to be, a voice of the soul, speaking the language of the heart. The Grand Hall was filled again a few weeks later. This time the atmosphere was different, softer, warmer, and free of the arrogance that had once hung in the air. The Vatican had announced another evening of music, a special event meant to honor the bond between faith and art. Invitations had gone out to the same guests who had attended the last concert, and news spread quickly that the young pianist who had once challenged the Pope would return to play again. People came with curiosity, unsure of what to expect. Some wondered if the event would feel like a repeat of that unforgettable night. Others whispered that the Pope himself had requested her to perform once more. The reporters were there too, ready with their cameras and notebooks, hoping to witness another moment that would make headlines. As the guests took their seats, soft candlelight glowed along the edges of the marble hall. The great piano sat at the center again, polished to perfection, waiting. The choir stood ready, their white robes glowing in the gentle light. The air was filled with quiet excitement, a sense that something special was about to happen. When the Pope entered, everyone rose in respect. He walked slowly, blessing those he passed, his face serene and full of warmth. There was no sign of the old debate between pride and humility now. Only peace. He took his seat as the applause faded. The young pianist walked onto the stage, not in a shining gown as before, but in a simple white dress. Her hair was tied back neatly, her steps calm and unhurried. As she approached the piano, she looked toward the Pope. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No words were needed. He gave a small nod and she smiled faintly before turning to face the audience. The silence in the room was deep enough to feel. Everyone could sense the change in her. Gone was the self-assured performer who once played for pride. What stood before them now was someone different, a woman who had been changed by something she could not put into words. She sat at the piano, closed her eyes for a few seconds and began to play. The first note was soft, like a whisper in a church at dawn. Then came another and another, forming a melody so tender, it felt as if the air itself leaned in to listen. The song was unfamiliar, but there was something sacred in it, something that drew people in without effort. Her hands moved slowly, gracefully, touching each key as if it were made of glass. Every sound was filled with emotion, carrying fragments of sorrow, forgiveness, and peace. The audience could feel the honesty behind it. It wasn't a performance meant to impress. It was a confession through music. The Pope watched quietly. His eyes glistened as the melody grew stronger. It reminded him of something he once told her, that music was a prayer made with sound. Now hearing her play, he realized she had understood. She wasn't just repeating his words. She was living them. The song built gently, layer by layer, like a rising sunrise over a quiet city. The notes shimmered in the air, wrapping around every listener like a warm embrace. Some people closed their eyes, others held their breath, and a few quietly wiped tears from their faces. The choir began to hum softly, joining her without being instructed. Their voices rose behind her playing, blending perfectly with her melody. It was as if they all shared the same emotion, the same reverence. The music and the voices became one. She played for several minutes, never once looking up. Her fingers seemed to move on their own, guided by something deeper than memory or practice. When the song finally came to an end, she let the last note linger, fading into silence. For a moment, no one moved. The stillness in the hall felt holy. Then slowly, the audience rose to their feet. But there was no shouting, no wild applause, just a quiet standing, the kind that comes from pure respect. Even the reporters, usually quick to chase drama, stood with lowered heads. The Pope rose too, his face filled with pride. Not the pride of victory, but the gentle pride of a teacher seeing his students surpass what he taught. He approached the stage, his steps unhurried. When he reached her, she stood and bowed deeply. The Pope placed a hand on her shoulder. The hall went quiet again, waiting. "My child," he said softly, "tonight, you did not play for the world. You played for heaven, and heaven was listening." The audience exhaled as if they had all been holding their breath. She looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. "Your Holiness," she said quietly, "I only played what my heart wanted to say. Thank you for teaching me how to listen to it." The Pope smiled and said, "No, my dear. You taught yourself. I only reminded you that the heart has its own music." There was a long pause filled with quiet emotion. Then the choir began to sing again, this time the same hymn the Pope had played weeks ago, the song written long ago for his sister. Their voices rose slowly, surrounding everyone in a wave of sound so beautiful it made the marble walls seem alive. The pianist stepped back from the piano and joined them, standing among the singers. Her eyes closed, her voice blending with theirs. It was not about her anymore. It was about the music, the faith, and the unity that sound could bring. The Pope closed his eyes and listened. His heart was full. It had been many years since he had felt that kind of peace, the peace that comes not from silence but from harmony. When the hymn ended, he turned to the crowd and spoke gently. "Music," he said, "is the purest form of prayer. It speaks to those who do not share our language, and it heals what words cannot reach. Tonight we have seen not a performance, but a transformation. Let this remind us all that humility opens doors that pride can never unlock." The people nodded, many moved to tears. The pianist looked down, humbled and grateful. She knew that this moment would stay with her forever, not because of the applause, but because of what it meant. After the event, people stayed long after the Pope had left. They spoke quietly about what they had seen, about how something invisible had touched them. Even those who were not religious felt something they could not explain. Reporters wrote articles that night not about scandal or surprise, but about beauty and grace. The story spread far beyond the Vatican walls. The story of the Pope who had once been mocked, who answered not with anger but with music, and who changed a proud pianist's heart with nothing but kindness and faith. As for the young woman, she continued to play around the world, but she was no longer the same artist she had been. Every concert she gave carried a quiet power that audiences could feel. People often said her music had a soul. When asked what had changed her, she never mentioned her fame or her technique. She only said, "Once I learned that music without humility is only sound, but when you play with truth it becomes something sacred." And in quiet moments, when she sat alone at the piano, she would sometimes play that same hymn again, not for applause, not for memory, but as a silent prayer of gratitude for the man who had shown her what true music meant. Back in the Vatican, the Pope often smiled when he thought of her. He never spoke of that night again, never took credit, never told the story as his own. But sometimes, late in the evening, when the halls were quiet and only the candles burned, he would sit by the small piano in his study and play the same melody, letting it drift through the still air, a soft reminder that grace could be found even in the humblest of notes. The melody carried through the quiet corridors and faded into the night, leaving behind the peace that only true understanding can bring. And though years would pass, those who had heard it, that song of forgiveness, faith, and love, and would never forget how it made them feel. Years passed, and the memory of that night inside the Grand Vatican Hall became something more than a story. It became a legend. People still talked about it quietly in music schools, in churches, and among those who loved the piano. It wasn't because of fame or drama, but because something genuine had happened there, something that felt timeless. The pianist's life had changed in ways she never imagined. She had been invited to play in cathedrals, concert halls, and even hospitals. Everywhere she went, people didn't just come to listen to her skill, they came to feel something. There was a calmness in her now, a depth that could only come from understanding life's quieter lessons. She never forgot that evening with the Pope, the way he had looked at her, not as a ruler or a critic, but as a teacher who saw her heart. His words still echoed in her mind. Music is the purest form of prayer. One winter morning, years later, she received a handwritten letter sealed with the Vatican symbol. Her heart raced as she opened it carefully. It was short, written in the Pope's familiar handwriting, the same calm, steady lines she remembered. My dear child, if the music still guides you, return once more. The choir waits, and so does your teacher in spirit, Leo 13th. Her hands trembled slightly as she read it again. She hadn't seen him in years. She knew his health had been failing, as the news had quietly reported. The letter carried no formality, no schedule, just an invitation full of meaning. Without hesitation, she packed her things and began her journey back to Rome. When she arrived, the city was dressed in golden light from the setting sun. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang softly through the air. She made her way through the familiar marble corridors of the Vatican, each step echoing memories. The guards recognized her and guided her to a small private chapel. Not the grand hall, but a quiet, simple place lined with candles and wooden benches. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes a person breathe slower. Inside, she saw him, older now, thinner, sitting in a wheelchair beside the small piano she remembered from before. His eyes lifted when he heard her footsteps and a slow smile spread across his face. My dear, he said in a weak but warm voice. You came. She knelt beside him, gently taking his hand. Of course I came, she whispered. Your letter said the choir waits, he chuckled softly. Yes, but I meant something more. The choir of life, the music we both learned to hear. They sat together for a while, talking quietly. He told her how proud he was of what she had become, not for her fame but for her heart. He said her music had reached places words could never go, prisons, orphanages, even war zones, through broadcasts and recordings. People said her songs gave them peace. She listened, humbled. It's because of you, she said. That night changed me forever. The Pope smiled faintly. No, child. That night God changed you. I was only there to witness it. Then he looked toward the piano. Play for me, he whispered. One last time. The song you played before. The one that silenced the world. She hesitated for a moment. Her hands shook slightly, not from fear but emotion. Then she sat at the piano. Her fingers rested on the keys. The air in the chapel felt alive again, like it remembered what was coming. She began to play. The same melody filled the room, but it was even softer now, gentler, carrying years of understanding within it. Each note seemed to breathe. The Pope closed his eyes, a peaceful smile on his face. The candles flickered with the rhythm of her playing. As she played, she felt something stir deep within her. A memory, a gratitude, a connection beyond words. She wasn't just performing for him. She was thanking him for everything. The sound grew warmer, richer, flowing like a prayer that filled every corner of the chapel. When the final note faded, silence followed. She turned to look at him, and for a moment he didn't move. His eyes were still closed, his face calm. She reached for his hand gently, and he opened his eyes. That, he said softly, was perfect. You have learned to play not just from your heart, but from your soul. I can go in peace now. Tears welled in her eyes. Don't say that, she whispered. You'll still be here and we'll play again, he smiled. I will always be here in your music. Every time you play, I'll listen. The Pope passed away quietly that night, surrounded by those who loved him. When the news spread, the world mourned not just a religious leader, but a man who had reminded the world of humility and grace. A few weeks later, a grand memorial was held. People from all over the world gathered at St. Peter's Basilica. The air was heavy with sorrow and reverence, and in the center stood the same piano, the one that had connected two souls through faith and sound. When it was time, she walked up to it again. Her white dress brushed against the marble floor. She sat down, hands trembling, eyes full of tears, but her heart steady. She began to play. This time the melody was different. It was new, soft but filled with life. It carried both goodbye and gratitude. The notes rose like a gentle wind through the cathedral, echoing off the high ceilings. People closed their eyes and wept quietly. She didn't look at the crowd. She imagined him there beside her, smiling as he always did. Every note felt like a conversation, a final one, between a student and her teacher, between a soul and heaven. As the last note faded, she whispered under her breath, "Thank you, Your Holiness." When she stood up, the entire hall rose with her. The silence was complete, powerful, sacred. Then, as one, the choir began to sing, the hymn that once joined their hearts long ago. After the ceremony, the piano was placed in a small museum within the Vatican, dedicated to Pope Leo XIII. On a plaque beneath it were his words engraved in gold. Music is the prayer that unites heaven and earth. Years continued to pass. The pianist grew older, but her devotion to music never faded. She began teaching young students not about fame or perfection, but about emotion, about truth. She told them that music was not about showing off skill, but about touching hearts. Sometimes, when her students played for her, she would close her eyes, listening quietly. If she heard honesty in their music, she would smile and say, "Yes, that's it. That's the sound of truth." She continued to play privately, too. Late at night, when the world outside was quiet, she would sit by her piano, light a candle, and play the same melody she once played for the Pope. The soft music would drift through the window and into the night, carrying memories, blessings, and peace. She never signed her name to her compositions anymore. She said music didn't belong to one person. It belonged to everyone who could feel it. On her final concert many years later, she played again in the Vatican by invitation of a new pope who had been one of her listeners as a boy. The hall was packed and cameras rolled, but she didn't care for any of that. When she began to play, the sound was full of both strength and softness, the kind that only comes from a lifetime of living, learning, and forgiving. The crowd sat motionless. It was as if time itself had stopped to listen. When she finished, there was silence again, that same silence from years ago. Then one by one people began to rise, but instead of clapping, they bowed their heads. The Pope himself stood, placed a hand over his heart, and whispered he would be proud. After that night, her name became part of history. But what people remembered most was not her fame, it was her heart. They said that when she played, you could feel something beyond sound, something that made you believe in goodness again. And somewhere, in that quiet space between notes, it felt as though Pope Leo XIII still listened, smiling, his lesson living on forever in every soul touched by her music.